Please be seated. This week there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times called "The Resilience of Religious Doubt." It was by one of my favorite religious writers. He's supposed to actually be an op-ed writer. I like the religious stuff he writes the best. I consider him a modern apologist after the early Christians who defended our faith when nobody really knew what our faith was. His name is Ross Douthat. And he usually writes about how we can actually find faith, even if we don't feel like we have it. But this week he was saying, as much as I support that and think that there's a logical way to have faith, I also recognize that there's reasons for doubt. And he said, take Christmas, for example, right? I mean, why was Jesus not born in a time where there were modern recording devices? Come on. Wouldn't that have been helpful? That if you believe even the two of the gospel writers who even write a story about Jesus' birth, there would have only been a handful of people there to take the video recording if they did have iPhones when Jesus was born. Why did so few people able to witness a birth that we believe transformed our society? And while we're talking about Christmas, what about, everything else, right? In a world where we are once again inundated with news of shootings in schools and in synagogues, and where people are hungry and cold and struggling, couldn't God just come down and prove God's existence once and for all for everybody? I'm sure God could do that. So why is it that God doesn't seem to be doing that? I wonder if that is what John the Baptist was wondering at the time that this gospel, that story that we heard was happening. If you're not familiar with John the Baptist, our favorite Advent character, he was a prophetic birth, born into prophecy, which in his case meant wearing weird clothes, eating bugs, and yelling mean things at people from the middle of the desert. Well, I wonder, though, something must have worked about that, right? Because people streamed out into the middle of nowhere and asked him to dunk them in open bodies of water, right? So there must have been something about him, something dynamic and real. But what was it? What did they think they were going to see, as Jesus asks? And what did John the Baptist think all of this was leading to? The Messiah, of course, he was pretty clear about that. But I wonder if when he was out there in the wilderness, if he thought someday he'd be sitting in jail weeks away from his execution. In Tucson, where my family and I lived for many years, the Feast of St. John the Baptist is celebrated on June 25th. Well, it's always celebrated on June 25th because he was born 6 months before Jesus. You see what they did there? A lot of attention put into making up exact dates for things that we really don't have exact dates for. But the convenient part of it happening in Tucson is that in Tucson, that also corresponds with when the indigenous people of that area celebrate the monsoons. Now, if you're unfamiliar with monsoons, you might be thinking this is some horrible, dangerous thing. And to be clear, in Tucson, they do have something colloquially called the stupid driver rule, right? If you are stupid enough to drive into a body of water that has flooded a road and then you get stuck, they're going to make you pay a fine. So you can bring yourself into danger if you want to after the monsoons, but if you're smart, it's not that dangerous as much as it is something that is needed, right? Because it's the desert, and it doesn't rain there, except for a few weeks, mostly out of the year, where it rains every day, quite a lot, in the afternoons, and they call that the monsoons. And June in Tucson is indescribably hot, right? They say it's a dry heat. I remember a friend said, yeah, dry like a blowtorch. If you go outside in the heat of the day in June, which no one in their right mind would do, it pretty much feels like a blowtorch in your face. So when the rains come, the desert really does rejoice. It's real. I've seen it. There's flowers and fruit, and the smell of the air changes. Everything is transformed. And the Tohono O'odham, who are one of the indigenous peoples there, they know what to do, right? They have these long sticks, you can see them, right? That they use to harvest the fruit that grows on the top of cactuses because, and I hope this goes without saying, you should not climb a cactus. Bad idea. And they take the fruit, they make jams and jellies and all kinds of delicious treats. And then they take the seed from the fruit and they boil it down into a nectar, which they also can use for food. But they give a tiny portion of that nectar to their medicine man, to their religious leader, and he makes a ceremonial wine. So they spend much of the year preparing to harvest fruit and then harvest fruit and canning it and all that kind of stuff. So when the rain comes, they use that ceremonial wine. And they have great celebrations. They have dances and ceremonial rituals, and they party. Because they know what to do when it rains, they know what to do when it doesn't rain. When John the Baptist was in what might be considered a dry part of his spiritual life, sitting there in prison, he sends his disciples to Jesus to say, are you the one that we've been waiting for, or are we to wait for another person? Which the subtext there is, did I waste my life, right? All of this work that I've been doing, was it really for nothing? And Jesus says to his disciples, go and tell John what you have seen, right? He doesn't say, tell him what I said or tell him how cool I am. He says, go and share what you have seen and what you have experienced, right? Because Jesus isn't just a catchy slogan or a really cool trick. Jesus is an experience of God's love that transforms the lives of people. When he quotes there from Isaiah, all those things, they have been witnessed by the disciples at that point, right? They've seen dead people brought back to life, lame people made to walk, blind people made to see, good news brought to people who thought they had nothing good left to remember. They know those things firsthand. But here's the hard part. John the Baptist doesn't, right? I mean, judging from the fact that he's primarily communicating with Jesus by sending people who visit him in prison to talk to him, it's pretty good bet that he wasn't there for some of those miracles, maybe not for any of them. And as far as we know, he didn't experience any of them firsthand. So you can kind of understand why he had some questions, why he had some doubts. But Jesus reminds him, via his disciples, that what matters is not that we never have doubts or questions, but that we live into the experiences of our lives. I imagine for most of us, there was a point in our spiritual journey, maybe early on in our faith, when we felt truly transformed and alive. And if a voice of God had told us to go into the middle of the desert and start dunking people into open bodies of water, we might well have done it. There have been moments where you have received the grace of God, the peace of God, the restoration of God, when you have recognized God's blessings. And there are other moments when you wonder, when you wish God would show up and prove once and for all that God existed and was doing exactly what you wanted. But that's okay. It's okay to have those moments. That's why Jesus says, go back and tell John what you have experienced. And he doesn't say, John's out because he asked a question. He doesn't say, too bad for John, he didn't get to see this. He says, share the experiences you have. Share how God has changed your life. And he says, John the Baptist is amazing, right? He testifies to who John the Baptist is, even though John the Baptist was questioning him and doubting who he really was in that moment. You see, the Tahana O'odham, they taught me that joy isn't just when you have the rains in the middle of the desert. It's all that work that you do, preparing and making a way for it. It's all the moments, even when it's so hot outside you can't stand it, even when you're sure it's never, ever, ever going to rain again. Even then, we can recognize God's presence in our midst and God's presence in us and in each other. So what do we do when we're waiting for the rain or waiting for Christmas? We do whatever it is that draws us closer to God. It might be sitting in silence. It might be walking in nature. It's a lovely week for that. It might be singing Christmas carols at the top of your lungs along with the radio. Whatever helps you remember that God is being born among us even now, that God's presence is real and a part of our lives. And as Jesus told us, we tell people that. Now, I know we're Episcopalians, so not like that, okay? But, it wouldn't kill you to talk to people about your experiences of God, especially people in this room, because we're all here, because we're seeking something holy. And we all have had moments where we've doubted and struggled. And one of the gifts of sharing our stories is that then when we come into moments of struggle, we can trust that other people will remind us of what God has been doing. But you can also share your story in the way that you live. If our God is present to us, if our God gives us gifts of peace and restoration and grace, how then should we be living? How can we treat other people and our own selves in the midst of this season in a way that reflects the incarnate love of God? That's what we do. Whatever helps us remember who God is and how God has been active in our lives. And we take a tiny little bit of that and we give it to our community, just like the Tohono O'odham do. And then we party. Then we dance.